Zoe, you're in Minneapolis and in the state of Minnesota, and it's in the northern US near the Canadian border. And yesterday there was Alex Pretti, a nurse who was shot by ICE, a kind of militarized immigration agency. And you were also in Minneapolis. Can you tell what is happening there?
You know, over 2 weeks ago, the Trump administration deployed over 2,000 federal agents to the Twin Cities, which is Minneapolis and St. Paul in the state of Minnesota. You know, as part of this overall immigration crackdown that the Trump administration has been waging on communities across the entire country, he targeted Minneapolis and St. Paul in large part due to the big migrant population that these cities have. Minneapolis is home to a lot of refugee communities, and notably the Somali community. And so he kind of weaponized the existence of these refugee and immigrant communities in order to kind of wage this battle of ideas against the migrants and say that they're all criminals. He used this very isolated case of one child care center having engaged in some dubious financial practices to say the entire Somali community is committing fraud, and launches this massive federal deployment into this area. And immediately the people here are just up in arms, resisting, organizing, fighting back. And in that context, we saw the murder of Renee Nicole Good, who went to a site where ICE and CBP officers had been deployed to carry out raids. And similarly, what happened yesterday in the Whittier neighborhood of Minneapolis, nurse Alex Pretti was also in part of these rapid response networks and mobilized to the site where a large number of CBP officers, which is Customs and Border Patrol, had deployed, most likely to carry out a raid against immigrant communities. And actually, in the moment where he's shot, he's trying to protect another woman from being tear gassed and terrorized by these federal officials. Of course, when they're extreme violence, they shoot and kill him. And immediately after, the community once again mobilized in huge numbers. And throughout the day, there were just massive continuous demonstrations around the site of the shooting, which were periodically repressed, tear gassed, and with protesters being beaten. So it's a pretty tense moment here in Minneapolis, but I would say the mood is of great rebellion and great kind of community care, which is something that's super notable.
Speaking about community care, etc., do you know something more about the victim, Alex Pretti? Who was he? He was a nurse filming the whole thing, or do you know more about what his colleagues or family is saying about him? What kind of person Alex was?
He is a Minnesotan. He worked at a VA hospital, and for European audience, that's a Veteran Affairs hospital. So they treat kind of exclusively veterans, so people who served in the armed forces of the United States. It's interesting because immediately after, there was film video clips of someone being shot and killed in the middle of the street. The Trump administration launches, unsurprisingly, a full-fledged media campaign to try to say that this guy was about to kill federal agents, that he had pulled his gun, all sorts of lies, which video evidence directly disproves. And it's interesting because now, after the fact, a lot of videos have circulated, showing, for example, Alex Pretti at his VA hospital, giving the last rites to veterans that had lost their lives. Of course, the Trump administration always speaks about the armed forces of the United States as the biggest heroes. This person here was literally caring for veterans, and he's made out to be some sort of criminal. So I think this is all really showing kind of the hollowness of these lies. There was a really beautiful statement that his family released talking about what kind of person he was. Just, again, he's a nurse that cared for people, reflecting the fact that the last thing that he did, he died trying to save a woman who was being attacked by these federal agents who are armed to the teeth. And you can see this in the videos. Their statement is, as the last line of it says, "Please get the truth out about our son. He was a good man," directly trying to refute the lies that the Trump administration is attempting to spread. We saw this in the aftermath of the shooting of and killing of Renee Nicole Good, calling her a terrorist. They even tried to investigate her wife. They wanted to press charges against her too, open up an investigation. So it's the same tired story of trying to, which of course, Black and brown communities in the United States have been facing for decades. When there's police violence against a Black person in this country, the first thing that the media and authorities do is try to paint them as some sort of aggressor, and of course that the police officers were just trying to save their lives. And so I think we're seeing that narrative repeated. And now the fact that it's being used even against white people is actually quite notable. And I think for a lot of people, it's opening up their eyes to the reality of police brutality and police violence in this country.
You said federal agents armed to the teeth, you said. But I think for an European audience, you have to explain a little bit what's ICE, what is it, what does it mean? People saying this is kind of private militias of President Trump. It was foreseen in Project 25, etc. But maybe you have to explain a little bit what is ICE and what are they doing? Like if they're going, you talked about 2,000 agents going to Minnesota or to Minneapolis. What are these agents doing? There are some pictures of kidnapping of parents in the presence of the children, etc. Can you paint a little bit of pictures about their presence and their disruptive presence in the communities?
Just over 2 weeks ago, there's a deployment of 2,000 federal agents from the Department of Homeland Security. And the Department of Homeland Security has two major law enforcement agencies, and those are the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency and the Customs and Border Patrol. And both of those are, again, like security forces that have guns. They have, quote unquote, non-lethal weapons like pepper spray, tear gas, batons. And they both are part of essentially immigration enforcement operations. So in this first deployment of 2,000 federal officers, it was, I think, a mix of ICE and CBP. People use them interchangeably. They're both law enforcement agencies of the Department of Homeland Security, which is the department or ministry that's in charge of carrying out Trump's mass deportation agenda. If people remember during his campaign, and kind of the promise that Trump made was that he was going to deport 10 million people from the United States, which is a crazy number. And essentially, in order to do that, he's used numerous federal agencies, but primarily the Customs and Border Patrol and the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so these are the agencies that are going, for example, door to door, oftentimes without a warrant, knocking places where they think that there might be people without papers are, going to workplaces where they know that immigrants are and terrorizing them, kidnapping them. They've been accused and there's been documented cases of them actually arresting citizens, which is completely outside their purview. Yeah, in a lot of ways, I think people are calling and saying that these essentially are private militias of Donald Trump, in the sense that this year they received record numbers of funding. In the past year, in the budget bill, they received record numbers of funding. At the same time, the other programs, of course, are being cut. So this agency received billions of dollars. They launched a mass recruitment drive. So they recruited thousands of people. A lot of them received maybe a week of training. So we're talking about a new agency being created, people having access to guns, to all sorts of kind of weapons, receiving very little training and given a very explicit political and extremely racist and xenophobic agenda. So their job is to go into immigrant communities, terrorize them, and arrest them. And so it's no surprise that these same agents are responsible for brutal acts of violence against the immigrant community. They've kidnapped children. They've waited outside of schools to arrest 5-year-olds. And then what we've seen in Minneapolis is that when the community has mobilized to stand between the immigrant communities that are being terrorized and these, armed thugs, they end up shooting the person that's trying to protect the immigrants. So we've seen kind of how this violence and how these agencies, which again have very little training, are often ideologically motivated, because if Trump is saying, I'm launching this immigration crackdown, who's with me? The people that are joining ICE right now, of course, it's not all of them, but a lot of them have this motivation. They want to be part of this, massive crackdown on allegedly these, undocumented immigrants in the country. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind, that a lot of people who are joining ICE right now and joining up are have this kind of political motivation and are doing it in the context of Trump and MAGA, completely criminalizing and launching these hateful, racist, xenophobic campaigns against, hardworking immigrant communities across the United States. We've seen them do deployments to other cities, Los Angeles, New Orleans, Charlotte, North Carolina, and in all of these cases, it had never been as many that are deployed now. And I'll just say, at first it was 2,000 that were deployed to the Twin Cities. And after the shooting of Renee Nicole Good, instead of admit a mistake and say, wow, like that was really out of line that a federal agent shot and killed a woman who was clearly trying to get out of a dangerous situation, they said, we're going to deploy 1,000 more agents. So currently there's over 3,000 CBP and ICE officers in Minneapolis and St. Paul who are conducting these immigration raids.
But what is crazy, Zoe, looking from here, because if you see these pictures of these law enforcers, ICE troops, whatever you call them, it's a kind of a military force. The law enforcement in the US is very militarized. If you see these gears, they have the weapons they dispose on, etc. There's a right-wing agenda also. They gunned down now in Minneapolis in 3 weeks 2 persons, Renee Good and Alex Pretti, etc. So you were there, people are on the streets. Why are people not afraid? Because you could say, okay, this is really force, this is intimidation, this is violence, a high level of violence put on the community and the whole city, maybe a whole state. But people, you described also the fact that there's no paralysis, but instead of paralysis, there is mass resistance. And that's a kind also in Europe, for example, we see the gunning down of people. We don't see the general strike. We don't see the resistance. We don't see the march of 100,000 people in Minneapolis in minus 20 or minus 30 degrees. We don't. So explain. Is there a special kind of people in Minneapolis, or is this a feeling everywhere in the US?
There's definitely a special kind of people in Minneapolis, because I think there's few places in the world, I would hazard to say, that would march 100,000 strong in negative 30-degree weather. Negative 30 is no joke. It really was negative 30 degrees on Friday. But we did see a massive general strike. And not only was there 100,000 people in the streets, but hundreds of businesses closed on Friday as part of this call that was given by labor unions, faith leaders, and then really supported and made even bigger by student groups, by small business owners in the immigrant community, and by the general public. It was a massive show of force. And I think it speaks to the fact that, of course, in the Twin Cities, but across the United States, people are extremely angry about Trump's policies, about the terror that is being inflicted on communities across the country by ICE, by CBP. They've been given a record number of funding to just go out and kill people while other things are being defunded. I know this is something that's being seen in Europe in terms of funneling money to the military while working people are suffering. And it just becomes all the more stark when those people that are receiving the billions of dollars are going out and killing people and then justifying it. So there is a lot of righteous outrage. Again, the strike on Friday was historic. There's mass calls to amplify this general strike, to make it nationwide, to extend it, understanding that, it is through the resistance of the masses that will actually make this policy change. And I think that more and more people are recognizing that Trump does not care about the community, does not care about anyone, and that's kind of driving people out. But also, I think something that's special about Minneapolis and what I saw yesterday, being out on the streets, being near the site of the shooting, was also really remarkable. I'd hope to think that's not unique to Minneapolis, but I was really moved by the sentiments of people who lived in the area, and as soon as they heard about the shooting, they didn't hesitate. They didn't hesitate, even though it was negative. Yesterday was a balmy negative 25 degrees. They came out to the streets and said, I'm horrified. I live in this neighborhood. These thugs come from out of state and they come and kill our community members. And so there is a sense of like, at the same time that the Trump administration is yelling about, these outside agitators and these activists that are starting trouble. And then you have like a militarized force that's coming in and killing community members. People really feel a sense of ownership and pride over their city, and a sense of, we need to get these federal agents out so that our community can be safe again. And so, everyday people just coming immediately to the site of the shooting again, just to say, we want these agents out. We want our communities to be safe. We love our immigrant neighbors. The unity, the message of unity, of coming together across race, ethnicity, class, was remarkable. It shows that, in the United States, that has been a country that has a very complicated history where there's, extreme racist policies and xenophobia and attempts to divide the working class on those lines. This sense of multinational unity is growing every day more stronger, because the violence that has been inflicted on Black communities, on Latino communities, is now being used against other races, against white people. And I think that what's funny is that the Trump administration thinks that it's gonna shut people up to shoot more people, but actually it's enraging them even more, and showing that the only way to resist this kind of violence is by coming together. And again, Minneapolis is a very special place. It's a place that's extremely ethnically diverse. You have malls that are run by Somali people where you can get Somali food. You have Vietnamese malls. You have such rich cultural and ethnic diversity, and so the people here have a great sense of pride in that diversity, and loving all of the different sectors of the working class, loving their neighbors. So it does, it is special in that sense. They have kind of a step up in terms of that unity and that sense of community. But I do think that it's a sentiment that is spreading across the United States, and that is contagious, because it's a sense of, we have to come together and we have to stand up against this.
Wow, it is amazing. I remember stories here in Europe, like during World War II, there was only one place in Western Europe where there was a general strike against the Rajas, because the Rajas against the Jews. It was in Amsterdam. The communists launched it in February 41, but this was high political, a general strike of the working class and the trade unions to protect the brothers and sisters from other origins. It's a high level, conscience thing to do. So, all my respect, I wanted to ask another question about, like, the elites in the US. They're maybe trying to protect themselves in a kind of a surveillance ecosystem, and you have all these messages about these new tools that ICE is using and Homeland Security forces are using, tested in Palestine against Palestinians. We're talking about facial recognition systems, about spyware or phone extraction tools, etc. That's are being tested in Palestine. There is even, I've been told, an ICE office in Israel, and so this collaboration between the IDF, the Israeli army, and ICE, and this surveillance society. How do you see this kind of evolution, and how widespread are these things happening in the US?
The US is definitely heavily surveilled, and a lot of this technology, as you said, has been tested in Palestine, has been, enhanced by, all of the testing of AI technology that was done during the atrocious genocide that, of course, continues against the people of Gaza. I think there is a high level of this. And what's interesting is that despite the advanced technology that these officers and these agencies have access to, they're still just casting an indiscriminate net. And I think the fact that they have access to such high technology and that they've been so careless and violent in their actions also just speaks to what their general agenda is, which is not carrying out, targeted operations. It's terrorizing communities. And so the fact that, they have these databases that they're developing, this, tapping into the security cameras. The challenges in places like Minneapolis and St. Paul and other Democratic-run cities across the US is that there has been slight resistance from the Democratic Party to engage in full cooperation. One of the quote-unquote challenges that the Department of Homeland Security faces is that, and this is largely why they've gone after these Democrat-run cities, is that, for example, Minneapolis is a sanctuary city, and so that means that technically law enforcement does not cooperate with these federal immigration enforcement operations. They can't share data in places that are Republican run. Often the police departments are working hand in hand with ICE and CBP to carry out the immigration enforcement operations. This, of course, completely enhances their ability to target communities. Of course, they terrorize them as well, but they have a lot more data. And for example, if someone gets pulled over for speeding and the police finds that they don't have papers, they'll immediately send them to the federal officers. In sanctuary cities, the hope is that they wouldn't. But yeah, I mean, these technologies just enhance the ability of these officers to carry out this terror. And I know that, of course, since Trump has assembled such a expansive team of these kind of tech moguls, of course, with Palantir CEO Peter Thiel, and then all of the different social media moguls really lined up behind him in this last election. That pool of data which they're pulling for is even bigger, and so it is quite terrifying. But I think there is a sense, at least here, that we know that they have all the technology to use against us, and there's no tool that they won't use. And so that being said, the only thing we can do, we're not gonna, we can't cover our faces because they already know who we are. We can just assume that they've identified all of us who are protesting out on the street. So the only thing we can do is inspire hope and resistance amongst more and more people, because it's one thing when you have a protest downtown of 50 people, you're worried about maybe repercussions, legal repercussions. Are they going to launch investigations? The only antidote to all of their technology is to make this movement even more and more massive. On Friday, you couldn't find anyone if you wanted to even try them. Your cell phone wouldn't work. Even with our own technology, it was impossible to find people. There's so many people out there. They can't arrest 100,000 people. They can't, it's impossible. They won't be able to. And so I think that the response to all of this technology and surveillance that's being used against activists, that's being used against immigrant communities, is to just make the movement even stronger, because we can't roll back their surveillance gains. We know it's going to just keep getting more and more precise and more developed. And the only thing we can do is to counter it with the masses on the street.
Wow, nice work, Zoe. I have a last question. -20 or -30 degrees. What do you do to protect your ears in that cold?
I wear the PTV hat, of course.
10 points.
Yeah, I mean, the cold is no joke. And I think that when people see the videos of people out there, it was hard for me to appreciate even before coming here, but it's the kind of cold where you have your hand out for 5 seconds and you already can't feel your fingers. Wow. So when people see that there's, the masses of people on the streets, you should know that they are bundled up to the point where they can't move their arms, and that they are really putting their bodies on the line to stand up against Trump and to stand up against these racist policies.
Okay, thank you very much, Zoe.
Thank you.